to In the Balance, the Iowa Judicial Branch podcast. Welcome to In the Balance, a podcast dedicated to exploring Iowa judicial system, and I'm your host, Abhash Shrestha. In this episode, we'll be exploring how the writers of the Constitution separated the power of the government into three branches, granting legislative power to Congress, executive power to the President, and judicial power to the courts. To understand more about the separation of power, we have Iowa Supreme Court Justice David May as our guest in this episode. Welcome to In the Balance, Justice May.
Thank you so much.
Before we dive into the topic, Justice May, could you remind us about your path to the Iowa Supreme Court?
Of course. First of all, I'm an Iowan by choice. I grew up in Missouri, and then I briefly lived in Oklahoma before moving to Iowa. It was actually 30 years ago in 1995. I came to attend Drake Law School, and I graduated from there in 1998. And then I worked at a small litigation firm, Hawkins and Norris, until 2001. And then from 2001 to 2016, I worked at a slightly bigger firm, Bradshaw firm. Now it's called Dickens and Bradshaw. But then in 2016, I was appointed to the Iowa District Court, and I served there for 3 years. And then in 2019, I was appointed to the Iowa Court of Appeals, and I served there for 3 years. And then in 2022, I was appointed to the Supreme Court, and I am still the newest justice and sometimes referred to as the baby justice.
So today's topic is about separation of powers. Can you provide a working definition of separation of powers?
Sure. So separation of powers is about the division of powers of a government into different branches, plus the idea that people who exercise powers of one branch shouldn't be exercising the powers of another branch. So generally speaking, as you mentioned, we're talking about the division of three kinds of power: the legislative power, the executive power, and the judicial power. So there are different definitions for these, but for today, I'll offer these. The legislative power is about making laws. The executive power is the power to give effect to and enforce laws. And then the judicial power is our authority to hear and decide cases and make binding judgments in them. And as part of that, it's the power to construe and apply the law as we resolve legal cases and controversies.
So when asked about the separation of powers, most people would think about the United States Constitution. Is that fair?
Yes, it is. Although it's interesting that the word separation of powers aren't actually in the United States Constitution, nothing like that. But it's undisputedly part of the structure. If you look at Article 1, you see that all legislative power herein granted is vested in the Congress, which consists of the Senate and the House of Representatives. If you look at Article 2, the executive power is vested in the President. And then if you look at Article 3, the judicial power is vested in the Supreme Court, as well as any inferior courts that Congress might choose to make.
And why was the separation of power important for the founders of the United States?
Well, I don't claim to be a historian, but the documents like the Federalist Papers and others give us some insight, and they show that separation of powers was indeed very important. Montesquieu is sometimes credited as being the one who sort of was the main source for the idea of a three-part system. But in any event, the founders like James Madison treated separation of powers as an essential ingredient. And their basic concern was that the founders had a certain amount of distrust for people. And as Madison put it, if men were angels, there would be no need for government. So in crafting this new United States government, they wanted to avoid putting too much power in the hands of any one person or any particular group.
Mhm.
Because if you gave them too much power, they might abuse it and cause tyranny. So more specifically, there was a concern about combining these different kinds of powers. Like if you gave the judicial power and the legislative power to the same people, for instance, then
Mhm.
again, you're asking for abuse and the demise of individual liberty. So, as a safeguard against this, they believe that these three powers, executive, legislative, judicial, should be
Mm.
separate and distinct.
That's very fascinating. And when you talk about dividing up the power, I think about federalism. Are federalism and separation of power related to each other?
They are separate ideas, but they are related. So again, when we think about separation of powers, we're usually talking about the various powers of one particular government, like the United States government.
Mhm.
In federalism, we're talking about a different kind of division. Federalism refers to this idea of having two or more different governments, and those governments divide or share power between themselves. Uh, so ordinarily, we're thinking about this in sort of ideas of two layers of government, like
Mm.
a general level of government, sometimes called the federal government, and then another layer made up of regional governments. In the United States, we have these two layers of government. We have a federal government, and that's the government of the United States. It's
Mhm.
headquartered in Washington, D.C. And then we have the various state governments, like the government of Iowa, headquartered in Des Moines. Now, it may seem paradoxical that more layers of government would be better from a civil liberty perspective, but in practice, federalism can be helpful because it avoids concentration of power in any one government. Uh, in fact, James Madison spoke of federalism as providing double security for the rights of the people. He said that the different governments will control each other, and at the same time, that each will be controlled by itself. There are other advantages to the federal system, including allowing people in different states to experiment with novel government programs. This is sometimes referred to as sort of the idea of
Mm.
laboratories of democracy. For instance, it wasn't that long ago that although Missouri had pretty liberal laws on private fireworks usage, Iowa didn't really allow much in the way of private fireworks usage, except
Mhm.
for a few sparklers and snakes and things. So each of those states was able to choose a different approach based on their own perceptions of what was best. Now, of course, Iowa has loosened up their fireworks laws quite a bit now, but it still retains the choice to go to a more regulated system if it wanted to.
Mhm. So, speaking of state governments, does the separation of power concept apply to Iowa's government as well?
It absolutely does. First of all, as with the United States government, the Iowa government is broken into three branches. Article 3 of our Iowa Constitution grants the legislative authority to the General Assembly, which consists of a Senate and a House of Representatives.
Mhm.
Article 4 of our Iowa Constitution vests the executive power in the governor. And then Article 5 of the Iowa Constitution uh, grants the judicial power to the Supreme Court and the District Court and any other courts
Mm.
inferior that the General Assembly might establish. So this structure is quite similar to the United States Constitution and shows very clear separation of powers. Our
Sure.
Constitution takes this notion a step further by making the separation of powers explicit. Article 3, Section 1 says that the powers of government in Iowa shall be divided into the legislative and the executive and the judicial. And then again, says that no person charged with exercise of powers belonging to one shall exercise powers of another unless it's expressly directed or permitted in the Constitution. So
Mm.
we have that as well. We also have some interesting other tweaks. For instance, under the United States Constitution, the Attorney General is appointed by the President and heads an executive department and serves at the pleasure of the President. In Iowa, the Office of the Attorney General is actually provided for in Article 5, which, as I just mentioned, concerns the
Mhm.
judicial power. And yet, the Attorney General is elected by the people and operates independently from the courts or the governor or
Mhm.
otherwise. So that's another interesting aspect of division of the power.
Hmm. Is the separation of power absolute, or are there some areas of overlap?
Our court has repeatedly acknowledged that the boundaries are not rigid. We've recognized a variety of areas of overlap. For example, we favorably cited a Massachusetts case that held that court facilities could be maintained either by the executive branch or by the judicial branch.
Mhm.
We've also held that although courts have an inherent power to appoint a special prosecutor, it was also okay for the legislature to grant power to county boards of supervisors to appoint
Hmm.
special prosecutors in some circumstances. And another example that people are familiar with is that although the legislative power is primarily in the hands of the General Assembly, the governor also gets to play a role through signature or veto. So there are a number of areas of overlap.
Interesting. What do you mean by checks and balances?
So this is a related concept. If we think of the separation of powers as providing the framework for the system, then checks and balances is sort of the way in which the different parts of the system interrelate. And more specifically, checks and balances
Mm.
allow each branch to help constrain the power of the other branches. And frankly, that's just a way to keep any one
Mm.
branch from having too much power. So, some examples would be the president has a power to nominate federal judges, but the Senate could slow or even stop their advancement through the confirmation process.
Hmm.
And another example would be the fact that Congress can pass bills, but the veto power remains in the president.
Hmm.
And another example is the fact that the president commands the armed forces, but only Congress may declare war, and Congress also controls the money. So, likewise, the Iowa Constitution also has a number of checks and balances. So, for example, just like the president has a veto power, that our governor also has a veto power.
Hmm. And do the concept of separation of powers and checks and balances impact the day to day work of the court?
They do. So, for the judicial branch, one of the main checks and balances is judicial review. Judicial review is this idea that although, for instance, the General Assembly might pass and the governor might sign a new law, the
Mhm.
courts might be called on to say whether or not that law is constitutional.
Mm.
And if it isn't constitutional, then the court must declare it unconstitutional and refuse to enforce it. We
Interesting.
also must police ourselves to be sure that our activities don't violate the separation of powers. For example, one of our core responsibilities is to interpret statutes and say what they mean in a particular case. But when we do so, we're bound by the words that were chosen by the General Assembly.
Mhm.
So we may not rewrite the statute so as to substitute our policy preferences for those of the elected lawmakers in the General Assembly. Rewriting a statute in that way would be a violation of the separation of powers.
Mm. And we have talked about the advantages of separation of powers, but are there also disadvantages?
Well, I think the primary disadvantage is inefficiency. You can imagine an autocratic situation, right? Where a single executive holds all the powers of government. And in that situation, the autocrat could just make up the law and then
Mm,
enforce the law as they like and interpret as they like and make judgments as they like. And there would just be no conflicts to overcome within that kind of government. This would be highly efficient, one might say, sort of in the make the trains run on time sense. But the cost of this efficiency, and just to be crystal clear, the insurmountable objection to this kind of approach is that this sort of concentration of power would present an unacceptable threat to liberty.
mhm.
And it's something we squarely reject here in the United States and in Iowa, particularly.
Thank you so much, Justice May, for sharing such in depth insight into the separation of power. I learned a great deal, and I believe our listeners will find this episode very educational. And with that, we conclude today's episode. We'll be back next time with another great topic. Until then, thank you for listening to In the Balance.